We're now in the second part of genetics where we're going to focus on non-Mendelian or non-simple genetics. But before we get too far into it, we're going to go ahead and look at one last tool that we can use to determine the probability or determine genotypes of people involved. And that's going to be the pedigree. The pedigree is basically a family tree that shows genetic trends through generations. And so we'll talk about some of the things we can use it for and some of the basics about pedigrees, as well as the setup for them. Now, if an individual has the dominant trait, then they have to have a parent who also has that dominant trait. And if an individual has the recessive trait, then the parents have to be heterozygous so that they can get the recessive allele from each parent. The heterozygotes are what we call carriers in this case, because they have the recessive allele, but they don't actually show the phenotype. It's important to note that we only see carriers when the trait is a recessive trait. We wouldn't call a heterozygote a carrier if it was a dominant trait, because then they would show that phenotype. So let's look at that pedigree and talk about some of the basics about these, and then do a little test one for ourselves. A pedigree is basically a tool to help document a trait of interest, and also a way for us to figure out how a trait is inherited when looking at multiple generations of family members. Now, in this case, for pedigrees, the squares will always represent males and circles always represent females. If this shape is colored in, it says that this individual does have the trait we're looking at, and if it's left white, then they do not have the trait we're looking at. We can use this to look at any type of trait, whether it's something harmless like eye color or hair color, or something like a condition that might cause ill effects of health. Now, when looking at these, we look at 1, 2, 3 generations in this case, and we see they're connected by lines. These lines show blood relatives or the production of offspring together. This line going across is what we call a marriage line. So from this grandfather to the grandmother, we're showing that these two have offspring together, and the offspring branch down from the marriage line. Obviously, marriage line is a little bit of an outdated term in that you don't have to be married to produce offspring. But since that's the term that is used to describe it, we're going to stick with that. So the offspring branch down from the marriage line. In this case, we have a daughter, a son, and a son. We notice I did not include this individual here, even though they're kind of under this umbrella, because their line does not directly connect to the parents. And that's because this individual here married into the family. They have a marriage line with one of the sons. If this person had a line connecting up, it would say that they were siblings who also had offspring together, and that's incest. So this person here married in. They share a marriage line, and they have one offspring together. Now, like I said, if it is a dominant trait, if it is a dominant condition, then an affected person will always have an affected parent. And so what I mean by that is, like, if you trace from this person up, like with a pencil, you trace this line, you would find that this parent is affected. And tracing up, you'd find that then they also have a parent who is affected. And so you can trace down the generations without picking up your pencil, finding someone who is affected all along the line. We can do the same thing over here. We find this female here, we trace up and find out her father has that trait, and then trace up from her father to find out his father had that trait. So if it's a dominant trait, you will always be able to trace down the lineage following who has the condition or trait. If it is a recessive condition, then you can potentially skip a generation. So let's say this father was not colored in and was white. We would trace this female up to her parents and find out that neither parent had the condition. The line stops because you would have to pick up your pencil to go find out the next person who had it. So that's one way to determine whether or not something is dominant or recessive. You can also look at the parents and their offspring to determine whether or not something's dominant or recessive by looking at whether or not parents are affected or unaffected. In this case, both of these parents are unaffected, and all of their children are also unaffected. If this was recessive, it would be entirely possible for these unaffected parents to have a child who was colored in because they have the condition. But since neither of them have the condition and none of the kids have the condition as well, then this is probably recessive, right? Not having the trait is recessive in this case. If both of the parents were filled in and the trait was recessive, then every single offspring would also have to have the trait. This is because then these individuals would be homozygous recessive, meaning they can only contribute recessive alleles to their offspring. If both parents can only contribute recessive alleles, every single offspring has to be homozygous recessive as well. If both parents were affected and they had offspring who were unaffected, that would be evidence of a dominant trait. Because they would both have the trait and they have an offspring without the trait, the offspring without the trait had to get recessive alleles from both parents. So let's go ahead and put this to the test. We're going to do a little bit of a pedigree puzzle, and we're going to focus on a condition called anuria in dogs and other animals, which basically means they're born without a tail. Not having a tail is considered recessive. So knowing that information, we're looking at this pedigree here. We see that the parents both have tails, and they have two offspring, one of which has a tail and one which does not. Since we have an offspring without a tail, we are able to determine the genotypes of both parents. So individual 3 has no tail, a recessive trait, meaning they have to have two recessive alleles. They had to get one recessive allele from each parent. But both parents have tails, meaning they have to have a dominant allele as well. This means both parents have to be heterozygous. They have to be heterozygous because they need the dominant allele to give them a tail and the recessive allele to give to the offspring so that they end up with no tail. Now looking further, let's say we have this offspring and this offspring here, or from another parent, and they're going to have offspring together. If we look at this female here and this male, what could their offspring look like? Now we know that this individual is most likely heterozygous because both of her parents are. And we know that this male here does not have a tail, so he's homozygous recessive. No matter what, this offspring is going to have a recessive allele, which means they can only be heterozygous or homozygous recessive. That basically gives us a 50-50 shot. Are they going to be with a tail or without a tail? So make sure to take some time to look through these pedigrees. They can be a little tricky. If you're having some trouble, make sure to come to office hours or come to the regular class scheduled meetings. If you are struggling with these, we can go through and practice these. I highly recommend doing that before the exam because you're more than likely going to see one of these on that test. But overall, we're just looking at a family tree and how things are inherited. There's a lot of information hiding in these pedigrees. As long as you know the key information to look for, they're really not as bad as they seem. Now, pedigrees can also show us the differences between males and females. Now, on the previous pedigrees, we did not really discuss determining X-linked and autosomal. We will do that later, in which we will identify sex-linked traits, but that's going to be for a later video. Make sure to watch all of these videos beforehand before really truly finding a grasp on pedigrees because you're going to link multiple things together.